So as you might be well aware from previous videos, we take a lot of footage. That all has to go somewhere. But if you want to keep it, how do you even deal with backing up or archiving it? But why would we need a backup? ZFS RAID Z2 is protected from 2 drive failures. A power supply failure could kill all of those drives. The building it's in could burn down. I could install a new version of ZFS on Linux that corrupts the data. It could get crypto-locked for one of the Windows PCs that has network write access. So having a second copy of the footage offline protects from all of this. Of course though, I could just throw it all away after I've made the finished video, but in a way, it is my holiday snaps, and I'm not ruling out wanting to do something different with it at a later date. But why out of all the different storage options you have, would you look towards tape? Well, 2 reasons. It should be more reliable than a hard drive. Tapes don't really degrade as much, they'll handle shock better. The lubricants in them don't gum up like old hard drives, the charge doesn't fade like SSDs. In fact, if it gets wet, you can really just let it dry out. It should also be cheaper than hard drives. The file server is set up with 8 disks, 12 TB each in RAID Z2. This is 96 TB of raw capacity, potentially containing as much as 72 TB worth of data to back up. So what tape formats are there? Well, firstly let's start with all the tape formats we're not going to use. Most tape formats that ever existed are now dead, and most never crossed the terabyte mark. Just considering the dead formats that at least made it over 100 GB, so they'd at least be somewhat usable today. I mean, you're not going to be backing up to audio tape with Kansas City Standard now, are you? I'm also going to ignore any marketing numbers that vendors provide assuming compression because, well, they're total crap. Especially in our case because we're storing compressed video, so any attempt to compress it further will almost certainly make it larger. So by this criteria, what is there to consider? Ampex DST, large quad density tapes, 660 GB. VXA3 holds 160 GB, 4 and 5 would hold 320 and 640, never released. Sony DTF2 held 200 GB, cancelled, never improved from there. Sony AIT5 holds 400 GB, the cancelled AIT6 was to hold 800. Sony Super AIT, SAIT2 holds 800 GB, 3 and 4 would hold 2 and 4 TB but were cancelled and never released. Sony DDS recorded onto much more common DAT tapes. In the DAT320 variant it can hold 160 GB, the Gen 8 variant was to hold about 300 GB. Seriously, Sony, what were you doing? Sony and inventing new media formats, name a more iconic duo. Now there's a few others that are still somewhat alive. Storage Tech T1000D stores 8.5 TB in a tape in the latest incarnation. IBM 3592 is still kind of alive, storing 50 TB in a tape in the latest Gen 7 incarnation. But these are both hugely expensive, pretty much limited to robotic tape library systems for big company archives. The hardware doesn't exactly come up on eBay very often. Oh yeah, and there's RDX. No, not that RDX. Sometimes this one erroneously gets referred to as tape. It's frequently marketed as an alternative to it. Capacity is up to 5 TB a cartridge. It launched into the market in 2004, but it never really exploded in popularity. In fact, it kind of failed to go off. It was marketed as having increased reliability compared to tape because the read-write heads are in the cartridge. But it's not tape though, it's a SATA hard drive in a trench coat, with special software to hide that from you by making it only able to be read or written through their special backup software. Later incarnations then put a SATA SSD in the cartridge instead. Yeah, a normal off-the-shelf SATA SSD. So if you were okay with just backing up onto SATA drives, then just buy SATA drives at a fraction of the cost. Unless you really need what their software offers, like, say, bizarrely enough for some of their hardware, the ability to make these things pretend to be a tape drive. Now, that, despite being rather cursed, could actually be useful for you if you really didn't want to change backup program. So what about optical media? I mean, we all remember burning CDs and DVDs a long time ago. They held so much. Well, not by modern standards though, 4.7 GB. So it'd take roughly 15,500 DVD-R discs to back up the whole file server. Turns out that's cheaper than I thought. It's about $4,000 worth to do it. Oh yeah, and it'd only be like 5 minutes a disc if you could burn it at 16 times, so that'd be roughly 54 days worth of continuous 24/7 disc burning? Yeah, no thanks. Okay, so dual layer DVD-Rs do exist at 8.5 gig each, but they're also a bit more expensive and they were never that common. Now, the dead format HD DVD did have an HD DVD-R format, a 30GB dual layer version supposedly existed, but this whole thing lost the format war to Sony's Blu-ray. Blu-ray initially came in single and dual layer 25 and 50GB variants, and the 50GB dual layer did come in a BD-R. Sony then went on to produce BD-XL, which had 100 and 128GB variants. Supposedly TDK produced a 200GB variant, but it never saw the market. Sony also had a much less known format, oh wow, Sony, another format? Called the Professional Disc, used for XD-cam cameras as a recording medium, which ended up with a quad-layer disc that supported 128GB. M-Disc is then a spin-off from Blu-ray that are readable and writable in a normal Blu-ray drive. They're designed for archival storage as they're stated to last several hundred years according to lab testing. But they still support no more than 100GB, the company going bankrupt before getting the BD-XL 128GB version out. Archival disc is another Sony-involved format, developed jointly with Panasonic, which promised 300, 500 or a terabyte in a single disc, but never shipped. Given this, the confusingly named Sony Optical Disc Archive was then released, which achieved 300, 600, 1200 and 1500GB in a cartridge in the first generation. Hey, finally we're getting somewhere. Inside though, these are just stacks of 128GB Blu-ray discs. Or actually some people say they're 128GB professional discs. How different are both of those formats really? Actually, it doesn't matter because it has some crazy burner inside it that uses 4 simultaneous lasers and reads back with 2 more, so that's not going to be readable in a normal drive for either of those formats. The third generation were then based on archival disc instead, and managed to make triple layer discs that gave the whole stack 5.5 terabytes of capacity. So that one's actually pretty good compared to everything so far, but the drives are hugely expensive. The cartridges are about $200 each, and being optical media of this kind, they're only writable once. But given that, overall I think we can actually write off optical media entirely here too. So what have we actually got left? Well, in the late 90s there were even more formats I didn't even mention. DIR, Ditto, SLR, Quick, ADR, Magstar and Trevan, just to name a few. Seems like everyone had a go at making their own. Even Sony, well, especially Sony. HP, IBM and Quantum thought that all this work to come up with formats just to discontinue them was a bit too much of a distraction from getting actual real work done, and they formed the LTO Consortium to make a shared open format of tape, splitting all the development costs between them. 2 formats with very 2000s names were devised. The first was Excellus, which uses a 2-reel tape loaded from the middle to minimize access time for random seeks, designed for cold-ish online storage type tape library applications. The second was Ultrium, which is a single-reel tape designed for high-capacity bulk writes for offline backups. Single reel makes the cartridge a lot smaller, well, some would say half the size, but it does mean that the tape has to be unspooled into the drive, and then respooled into the cartridge. While Excellus is not known to have ever actually been developed into a commercial product, Ultrium was eagerly accepted by the market. So these days, tape backup pretty much means LTO Ultrium. In fact, it's pretty much just called LTO Tape at this point, Excellus having become a mere footnote in history, the consortium thus beating Sony at their own game by not even producing the format before it was cancelled. LTO tapes have been released so far in 10 generations, the 10th only just having been announced at time of recording. LTO 9 drives, however, are out on the commercial market, so I guess we just go buy a few of those, buy a drive, and oh, yeah, that's more than the whole file server cost. That rivals the cost of a decent used car, so we might just have to look at the second-hand market here for this one. But which generation do we actually pick? So we can see that with a few exceptions, LTO roughly doubled in capacity for every generation. Although we can see from the advertised roadmaps that they were sometimes a bit optimistic. I think at this point we can raise the standard from 100GB and discount LTO 1 to 4. With under a terabyte per tape, they're probably not worth bothering with. Even at that point, 72 tapes would be a pretty crazy number. So how do the tape costs compare between these generations? LTO 9 tapes are expensive, LTO 8 tapes are expensive as well. LTO 7 tapes are a bit cheaper than that, but for LTO 6 and below, new tapes are all pretty much the same price. Why new? Well, it's pretty rare that used tapes ever get sold, especially as they'll no longer function after being bulk erased, so there's really no easy way for a company to wipe their data from them. So what this means is, cost per terabyte actually dramatically goes up the older you go, even though they're thoroughly obsolete and practically useless. So now let's look at the other half of the bargain, the drive cost. There's a proliferation of cheap ex-enterprise hardware like 10 gigabit network cards, rack mount servers and the like for extremely cheap prices, to the point where a lot of it can actually be hard to get because it's barely worth selling. Tape drives? No, not so easy. In fact, you'll probably find that's because they're still in use in a lot of enterprise. So it looks like to me LTO 6 is the sweet spot here. LTO 5 drives, you'll save a bit of money on the drive, but then you'll need twice as many tapes, which pretty much cost the same, so that adds up fast. 2.5 terabytes per tape in LTO 6 is a pretty decent chunk. Going up to LTO 7 would more than halve the cost of tape, but it will more than double the cost of the drive, so the return on investment makes the few thousand extra dollars you'd need for LTO 7 quite a bit of a tougher sell. But why is LTO 6 such a bargain? In terms of compatibility, the original plan was that LTO drives can read and write to one previous generation, and read 2 generations back. But with LTO 8, they broke that promise. Those can read and write 7, but can't use 6 at all. Similarly, 9 can read-write 8 and not use 7 at all, so there's now much more of an incentive to upgrade. And for a late-breaking update, it does appear that LTO 10 will not be backwards compatible at all. So if you're expecting that to push prices down, you may be disappointed. Companies will be hanging on to their existing drives as a result. So given those, it seems that LTO 6 got bumped, and a lot of places do want to move it on. And the cost for an enterprise to do that is actually less than you think. If you have a tape library, you can just pull out the drive sled, put a newer drive in, and replace all of the tapes out one by one, which are all still the exact same form factor from LTO 1 upwards, so the robot loading bit is still fully compatible, and that's a key advantage of the long-lived LTO format. So that's actually how I managed to get a particularly good deal on an LTO 6 drive, if you want to be a bit trickier about it. But more on that in a bit. So how do you connect one up? There's basically 2 different interfaces for modern tape drives, SAS or Fibre Channel. Some of the older ones were SCSI, but nothing newer than LTO 4 will be. Although, funnily enough, SAS and Fibre Channel both do use the SCSI protocol, just not the hardware interface. Choice of interface of course affects cost. There is actually a third option here, USB tape drives. These are SAS ones with a converter board attached. They are of course the most expensive because they're by far the most convenient to use, and your only option if you can't install PCIe cards. Of the other 2, the SAS drives are generally more expensive than the Fibre Channel ones. The general advice given online is always go for the SAS drives, as Fibre Channel is apparently very difficult to get working. But a decent SAS HBA of a new enough revision to work properly with these drives will run you about $200 second-hand, as they're actually still pretty useful in conjunction with breakouts to connect a pile of SATA drives on your file server. Whereas you can find an 8 gigabit PCIe Fibre Channel HBA for less than $30, SFP transceivers included. The optical fibre cable to connect both together will then cost you about $10, and as for Linux support, yeah, you can just pretty much pick any of them. They're all based on the same QLogic chips, and you're pretty much guaranteed they'll just work. Now, if that seems surprising to hear about hardware on Linux, remember this is server hardware. While the year of Linux on the desktop might be a running joke, Linux on servers, it's pretty much the norm. The downside to this is that you probably won't have any other Fibre Channel gear, so this will be taking up an entire PCIe slot in your server, whereas if you got a SAS HBA you could at least use it to whack a few more hard drives in. So while I mentioned that an LTO 6 drive would cost you about $1,000 to $2,000, I found this LTO 6 drive for about half that. It's Fibre Channel, but you'll also see it has some other strange connector on the back, as it's out of a tape library. But then how the heck do you power this thing? Well, obviously not down the fibre optics. It has a proprietary connector for a specific product line of tape libraries on the back, and that explains why it's so cheap. But of course, it's not really a bargain if I can't actually use it. So a little bit of research shows it's apparently powered from the tape library via 48 volts. Now that would actually be okay. I do have a few 48 volt power supplies that will be able to feed it in the 2 amps that it wants. So if we pull off this back panel, there's some sort of control board and power supply here. Seems pretty overkill actually. There's an entire Motorola 68000 variant on this. Like what's in the original Mac and many other high-end 80s desktop computers, what they had as a CPU. A bit of poking around and a careful look at the PCB reveals where we can tap into the power input, and with some wires soldered on we can feed it 48 volts. We get blinking lights and no smoke, but the tape drive doesn't power on. So unfortunately there's probably some sort of communication needed here to turn it on. But you'll notice that there's actually just a normal Molex connector leading into the back of the drive, as this isn't wildly different from the normal variant of the drive on the inside. We can actually just take this board out, ignore it entirely, and just power the drive up from the Molex connector. Just use a spare PC power supply with a paperclip in the 24-pin connector. No, I'm not going to run a power cable out of the file server to power it. One mishap doing that and you could kill all the hard drives in the file server, and I haven't even backed them up yet. Now, what about the firmware on the tape drive? I've read that HP tape library specific drives do work fine if you bypass the module like this. One of the connectors on the back has a pin that's pulled low when it's in a tape library to signal to the firmware that it is in one. When you just unplug that board and it's not connected to anything, it just acts like a normal drive as it's doing now. I've heard that the IBM variant of this drive is not amenable to this kind of hackery, as the tape library units have a completely different firmware. On the other hand, I've also read someone saying that you can't do this with any HP drive either. In fact, pointing at this exact drive and enclosure specifically, so go figure. So now for the data side. Installing the QLogic Fibre Channel HBA into the file server, taking out the video card to do so. Surprisingly, this motherboard happily runs without video despite the specific AMD CPU not having support for onboard graphics. Yeah, okay, I won't ask. So our tape drive will be dev st0. We can use the empty command to control the tape drive, short for magnetic tape. We run status, and this shows us a few parameters about the drive. Another useful command is sglogs. This stands for SCSI generic logs. If we select page 17 hex, volume statistics as the log to read, we see some info about the inserted tape. Fun fact, none of this is actually stored on the magnetic media. It's all on an RFID tag in the front of the LTO cartridge. This means that your tape robot can read it without actually having to put it into a drive, and LTO drives won't even attempt to load and potentially damage incompatible generations of tape. Okay, so we can't just go ahead and put a file system onto the tape. Conventional file systems really don't work with the way tape drives do. Yes, there is LTFS, but that's much more commonly used on Mac and Windows desktops just wanting to copy stuff to tape. So let's go ahead and write some stuff onto our tape here. Now you'll notice that we can write 4 files onto the tape like this. However, unlike if you did this with a hard drive, they don't overwrite each other. You'll note that we're using dev nst0 here. The N means no rewind, so it doesn't rewind again after we close the file. It's actually writing all 4 sequentially to the tape with end of file markers placed after each one. We can then rewind the tape using MT again, and then we can read our files back again. But there's a limit to how many files you can do this with, and there's no metadata saved for them like, say, file name. So what we need is some sort of utility to store all of this while it archives multiple files into one. Something like, say, TAR, which stands for, Tape Archive. It's right there in the name. And there we go, we've backed up a folder to tape. We can then rewind the tape again and use TAR to read the archive, printing out what's in it. Rewind once again and let's restore the archive. And there it is. Okay, so this is how you do a simple backup to tape. But perhaps you should be using dedicated backup software here. We've instead chosen to do this through BareOS, Backup Archiving Recovery Open Source. This is pretty useful if your backup needs to span multiple tapes. It can handle this and keep a central catalogue of files so you don't have to insert every tape to list the files on it. Suppose you wanted incremental backup instead. Well, that's easy. Also, suppose your disks can't quite keep up gathering a million small files as the tape drive's writing, forcing the tape drive to start and stop repeatedly, which is not only bad for wearing out the drive, it also wastes a small amount of space on the tape every time it does it. But what do we use for this temporary storage? So for a 250GB Samsung 980 Pro, the expected lifespan of that SSD is about 150TB written to it. So that's 2 whole backups of our entire array, and Samsung no longer expects that SSD to work. The 1TB Intel 665p is not that much better at only 300TB written. While the drive probably will outlast those numbers just fine, we really don't want to kill our boot drive. So where else can we put it? On the disk array we're reading from? Yeah, how about no? So let's spool to RAM instead. A 20GB chunk of the file server's 64GB of RAM isn't that bad to take. While ZFS needs a lot of RAM, this shouldn't hurt performance that much. This means that we'll have one start-stop every 20GB, but on the other hand it was certainly happening way more frequently than that when backing up bits of the file server that stored a lot of tiny files. Now we've actually gone ahead and configured 2 separate backups here. We have the personal files backed up completely every time. With that, there's spooling enabled. But the video files backup is an incremental one which keeps deleted files, and no spooling is necessary as these files tend to be pretty big. So, time to go ahead and fire up a backup. But first, do we need to clean the drive? You need a cleaning tape, and I would recommend buying a spare tape for experimenting that you won't use in your primary backup run. Cleaning tapes are pretty much universal between generations, and there's actually not any software needed to use one. You just put the tape in, it'll run the cleaning cycle, then eject. If you see the cleaning light come on when you haven't got a cleaning tape in the drive, that's the drive telling you it needs cleaning. So really, use it once when you first set up the drive, then don't use it again until the light comes on. If you run it too often, that's not a good thing, you're just wearing out your tape head. So I managed to buy a set of 20 tapes cheaply off eBay as a pack intended for a tape library. This means it comes in one big plastic box rather than individual clamshell cases. This also means they come with barcodes on them for the tape library to determine which tape it's holding. Useless to us mere humans? Or are they? Well, it means they've got unique names so you can find the exact tape the software wants. So there's the important data which ends up fitting on 3 tapes. Yeah, for backup purposes I'd like to have 2 copies of that to be safe. One can be a few weeks behind the other time-wise. And then we stick some painter's tape over the slot in the front of the drive as it lacks a dust flap, and the tapes go into the off-site storage location. So in conclusion, with the drive costing about $550, the Fibre Channel card costing $35, that's actually a little more than usual because I had to find the weird variant with a low profile bracket, and then a collection of 50 tapes that cost about $30 a tape. So that's 125 terabytes worth of tape for about $1,500, or about $2,050 if you count the tape drive. If you were buying the 12 terabyte hard drives instead, you would end up with 52.45 terabytes worth of storage for that cost. So having the equivalent capacity in hard drives alternatively would be $4,885. Obviously this is a pretty big saving. But what about the cloud? Now storing it on S3, assuming one copy as Amazon does keep it redundant themselves, would cost you about US $1,673 a month, or about 2,700 Australian dollars. That's more than the cost of this whole thing just for a month of storage. You could reduce this to $921 US if you put it into infrequent access, or you could get it as low as $128 a month if you put it in Glacier Deep Archive, but it's going to cost you to get that back. Backblaze will do it a bit cheaper for $432 US a month with free retrieval, or just short of $700 Australian. You could bend the rules a bit to put this in Backblaze B1 for $99 a year, which is a very attractive price, but you are kind of bending the rules by backing up a whole file server to their flat rate plan, and you are taking the risk that they won't crack down on this sort of thing, as they would be undoubtedly losing money on you. Also, if you don't run the client to update your backup at least every 30 days, they may just delete your backup. So in the end, tape and second-hand X-Enterprise tape drives are still a viable backup method even in 2025, even if it turned out to not be quite as cheap as I was hoping. But maybe the cost of hard drives will come down to the point that I'm willing to take the risk on using them. Or maybe it won't. These drives cost $475 a piece in 2021 when I built the file server, and $469 now. Adjusted for inflation to today's money, that'd be about $550, so they are roughly 15% cheaper than they were. That's really not much when you consider how much computing hardware usually drops in price for the same specifications. That said, we've had exposure to the Aussie dollar here on both sides, as well as the last half decade or so not being particularly typical, so go figure, I guess. Any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll answer. Next up, we'll be back on the supply side of the problem, don't worry. For more not quite like this, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and see you next time.